The bell rang in a New York courtroom in 1976, the kind of sound that should announce nothing more dramatic than the next case on a crowded docket. But what followed was anything but routine. A congressional committee, led by a senator from Idaho, had just confirmed something that sounded like fiction. For more than 2 decades, the Central Intelligence Agency had maintained secret relationships with American journalists, not informants on foreign battlefields, not spies recruited from enemy nations. American reporters, editors, and media executives working inside the most trusted institutions of the free press, some of them filing stories shaped in part by the very agency sworn to operate beyond America's borders. How many? Which outlets? What stories were touched by invisible hands? Those questions would haunt journalists, historians, and lawmakers for the rest of the 20th century, and many of them remain only partially answered today. This is the story of how that happened, why it happened, and what we actually know versus what has only ever been alleged. Before we go further, if stories like this pull you in, the kind built from declassified files and congressional testimony rather than rumour, take a second to hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming. There is far more ahead than most people realise. To understand why an intelligence agency would ever consider American newspapers and broadcasters part of its operational toolkit, you have to go back to the smoking ruins of 1945. The Second World War had just ended, and the United States found itself in a position it had never occupied before. The most powerful nation on Earth, with an economy untouched by the bombing that had flattened Europe and parts of Asia, and a military that had just demonstrated the most devastating weapon in human history. But power brought a new kind of fear. The wartime alliance with the Soviet Union, forged out of necessity against a common enemy, was already fracturing by the time Germany surrendered. Joseph Stalin's Red Army occupied half of Europe. Communist parties were gaining strength in France and Italy. China was sliding towards civil war that would end in 1949, with a communist government controlling the world's most populous nation. American policymakers watched all of this with mounting alarm, and they came to believe that the next great conflict would not necessarily be fought with tanks and infantry, it would be fought with ideas. This was the atmosphere in which the National Security Act of 1947 created the Central Intelligence Agency, replacing the wartime Office of Strategic Services that had run espionage and sabotage operations against Nazi Germany. The new agency's charter was deliberately vague about covert action, a vagueness that would later be exploited and debated for decades. Officially, the CIA existed to coordinate intelligence gathering and analysis for the president. Unofficially, men like Allen Dulles, who would become the agency's director in 1953, believed that the United States needed an apparatus capable of fighting a different kind of war: psychological warfare, propaganda, the shaping of public opinion both abroad and, controversially, at home. The fear driving these men was not abstract. Internal CIA and State Department documents from the late 1940s describe genuine anxiety that Soviet propaganda, communist labor unions, and sympathetic intellectuals could erode American and European public support for resisting Soviet expansion. Washington had watched as the Soviets built an extensive global propaganda apparatus, and American officials worried that the United States had no equivalent capability. Out of this worry came the Office of Policy Coordination, established in 1948 under Frank Wisner, a former OSS officer and Wall Street lawyer who would become one of the central architects of America's Cold War covert action programs. Wisner's organization was tasked with political warfare, economic warfare, and propaganda, operating with a level of secrecy that even other parts of the American government did not fully understand. It would later be folded into the CIA itself, but its DNA, an institutional comfort with manipulating the flow of information, would persist within the agency for decades. It was within this context, sometime in the early 1950s, that what later journalists and investigators would refer to as Operation Mockingbird began to take shape. We need to pause here on something important. The name itself is a source of genuine historical confusion. Despite its widespread use today, no declassified CIA document has ever been found using the term Operation Mockingbird as an official program name. The phrase appears to have entered public consciousness primarily through later journalistic and author accounts. most notably Deborah Davis's 1979 biography of Washington Post publisher Katharine Graham's husband, Philip Graham, and subsequent retellings by researchers including Carl Bernstein, whose landmark 1977 investigation we'll examine closely. Whether Mockingbird was ever an actual code name for a single, unified, formally structured program, or whether it has become a catch-all label applied retroactively to a loose and evolving constellation of CIA media relationships, is itself a matter of historical debate. What is not in dispute, and this is critical, is that the underlying activities the name refers to were real, extensively documented, and confirmed by the United States government itself. The man most frequently associated with running these media relationships was Frank Wisner. Multiple credible sources, including journalists who interviewed former CIA officers and the findings of later congressional investigations, described Wisner cultivating what he reportedly referred to, according to some accounts, as his mighty Wurlitzer, a metaphor for an instrument capable of playing any propaganda tune the agency required across dozens of media outlets simultaneously. The image is almost theatrical, and that's worth sitting with for a moment. Picture Wisner, a man with the bearing of a patrician lawyer, working from an office in Washington, coordinating relationships not through blunt instruction, but through years of cultivated trust, shared anti-communist conviction, and old boy networks that ran through Ivy League universities, elite social clubs, and the shared experience of wartime intelligence service. That last point deserves emphasis, because it explains something that otherwise seems implausible. Why would respected American journalists agree to any relationship with an intelligence agency at all? The answer, according to historians who have studied this period, lies substantially in shared wartime experience and shared ideology rather than coercion or payment alone. Many of the journalists later identified as having CIA ties had served in the OSS during the war, working alongside future CIA officers in genuine wartime intelligence operations. They emerged from that experience believing, often sincerely, that the Soviet threat justified extraordinary measures, and that a free press cooperating quietly with American intelligence was not a betrayal of journalistic principles but a patriotic extension of the same fight against totalitarianism they had waged against fascism. This doesn't excuse what followed, but it explains it, and understanding the difference matters enormously for getting this history right. If you're finding the texture of this story as unsettling as I do, let me know in the comments what surprises you most so far, because we're only getting started and the documented evidence gets significantly more concrete from here. The most well-established and heavily documented CIA media program of this era was not, in fact, a secret domestic press operation, but something called Operation Mockingbird's lesser-known but better documented cousin, the Congress for Cultural Freedom, along with related efforts to fund and influence magazines, publishing houses, and international broadcasting. The CIA, through a network of front foundations, channeled funding into publications like Encounter magazine in Britain, into international student and labour organisations, and into cultural programmes designed to demonstrate the intellectual and artistic vitality of the free world compared to the Soviet bloc. This was confirmed beyond dispute in 1967, when investigative reporting, first by Ramparts magazine and then picked up by the New York Times and other outlets, exposed the CIA's covert funding of the National Student Association and, by extension, a sprawling web of cultural and publishing organisations. The 1967 revelations caused a genuine scandal, forced President Lyndon Johnson to commission a formal review, and led to public assurances that such domestic-facing covert funding would cease. It is essential to understand that this 1967 scandal, while related in spirit, is historically distinct from what would later be revealed about direct CIA relationships with individual American journalists, even though the two stories are sometimes conflated in popular retellings. The deeper, more specific story of CIA relationships with working American journalists came into full public view a decade later, in October of 1977, when Rolling Stone magazine published a 25,000-word investigation by Carl Bernstein, the journalist who, alongside Bob Woodward, had helped bring down a presidential administration through the Watergate investigation just 3 years earlier. Bernstein's piece, titled "The CIA and the Media," remains the single most influential and most cited piece of journalism on this subject, and it deserves careful examination both for what it revealed and for how it has been characterized, and sometimes mischaracterized, in the decades since. Bernstein's central claim, built from interviews with more than 200 people, including current and former CIA officials, was staggering in scope. He reported that, over the preceding 25 years, more than 400 American journalists had, in his words, secretly carried out assignments for the CIA, according to his own sources within the agency. These relationships, Bernstein wrote, ranged enormously in nature. At one end were journalists who knowingly and formally functioned as paid intelligence assets, providing the CIA with information gathered in the course of their reporting, sometimes overseas, and occasionally allowing their credentials to serve as cover for actual intelligence officers operating abroad. At the other end of the spectrum were journalists who maintained looser, informal relationships, occasionally trading information or perspective with CIA contacts they considered friends, sometimes without fully appreciating the operational significance of what they were doing. Crucially, and this is a point often lost in popular retellings, Bernstein's reporting did not claim that the CIA was systematically dictating the content of American news coverage on domestic political matters. Rather, his sourcing pointed primarily toward relationships connected to foreign correspondence and Cold War intelligence gathering, with journalists at major outlets sometimes briefing CIA officers on their findings from assignments in Moscow, Cairo, or Saigon. Sometimes accepting CIA-supplied story leads designed to serve foreign policy aims, and in a smaller number of cases, working under formal contractual arrangements with the agency. According to Bernstein, the organizations whose journalists had documented relationships with the CIA included some of the most prestigious names in American media. He named the New York Times, CBS News, and Time magazine as having had the deepest institutional relationships, reporting that these organizations' leadership had, at various points, cooperated directly with the CIA, sometimes allowing the agency to review material before publication, sometimes providing official cover for CIA personnel operating as journalists abroad. He also named, with varying degrees of specificity, individuals at the Associated Press, United Press International, Reuters, Hearst newspapers, the Miami Herald, the Old Saturday Evening Post, and the New York Herald Tribune, among others. Two names recur most frequently in serious historical accounts of this period, and they deserve particular attention. The first is William Paley, the founder and longtime chairman of CBS, who, according to Bernstein's reporting and subsequent corroboration, had a personal relationship with Allen Dulles dating back to before Dulles became CIA director, and who allegedly permitted the agency to use CBS News as a vehicle for intelligence gathering and occasional cover, particularly through the network's foreign correspondence. Paley denied any formal agreement with the CIA, though he acknowledged a friendship with Dulles and acknowledged providing what he characterized as informal cooperation consistent with patriotic duty, a distinction that itself reveals how blurry these relationships could be. CBS, for its part, has historically maintained that it never knowingly allowed its news operations to be compromised, while also acknowledging the historical record of contact between network leadership and intelligence officials. The second figure who looms largest is Philip Graham, the publisher of the Washington Post throughout the 1950s and into the early 1960s, until his death in 1963. Graham was, by multiple accounts, a close personal friend of Frank Wisner himself, and Bernstein's reporting, along with Deborah Davis's later biographical work, describes Graham as having played an active, willing role in connecting the CIA with journalists and helping coordinate aspects of the agency's media relationships, reportedly even helping select which reporters might be approached for cooperation. This is one of the more historically contested claims in the entire story. Graham suffered from severe bipolar disorder in his final years and died by suicide in 1963, which complicates any straightforward account of his motivations and the full extent of his involvement, since he was never able to respond to the fuller allegations that emerged after his death, and some of the claims about his role rely on second-hand accounts rather than documentary evidence. The Washington Post itself has long disputed characterizations suggesting any systematic ongoing arrangement with the CIA, while not disputing that contacts between its leadership and the agency existed during this period, a position consistent with how most named institutions have responded to this history, acknowledging contact while disputing claims of systematic editorial control. This is where I want to pause and offer you something important. If you've made it this far, you're already deeper into the documented history of this story than most people ever get, because most retellings online skip straight past the nuance into the most dramatic version of events. Stick around, because the congressional investigation that forced the CIA's own hand is where this story becomes undeniable, and it's coming up next. The congressional reckoning that finally forced the CIA to confront these allegations, at least partially in its own words, began not because of Bernstein's article, but slightly before it, in 1975, when a Senate committee chaired by Idaho Senator Frank Church was formed in the wake of a much larger crisis of trust in American intelligence agencies. The Church Committee, formerly known as the United States Senate Select Committee to Study Governmental Operations with Respect to Intelligence Activities, was convened after a series of explosive revelations, including New York Times reporting by Seymour Hersh in December 1974 that the CIA had conducted illegal domestic surveillance operations against American citizens involved in the anti-war and civil rights movements, a program that would later be confirmed and detailed as Operation Chaos. The Church Committee's mandate was sweeping: examine the CIA's assassination plots against foreign leaders, its domestic surveillance programs, its mail opening operations against American citizens, and included within this broader scope, its relationships with American media. The Church Committee's findings on media relationships, published in its final reports in 1976, were more cautious and more narrowly scoped than Bernstein's subsequent reporting would be, but they were nonetheless historically significant because they represented the United States government's own confirmation that such relationships existed. The committee's report stated explicitly that the CIA at that time maintained covert relationships with several hundred individuals who provided intelligence information for the agency from the United States media. This is again an extraordinary admission, made not by an outside journalist, but by a formal Senate investigative body with subpoena power and access to classified material. The committee further found that some of these relationships dated back to the agency's earliest days, and that approximately 50 of these individuals were, at the time of the investigation, American journalists or employees of American media organizations directly employed by or paid by the CIA, while several hundred more had informal relationships of varying kinds. Importantly, the Church Committee also documented something that adds a deeply troubling dimension to this story: evidence that the CIA had, at various points, used journalistic cover for actual intelligence officers operating abroad, embedding agency personnel within American news organizations as a way of gaining access to foreign countries and foreign sources under the protection of a press credential. This practice, beyond the question of journalists cooperating with the agency, raised separate and serious concerns because it meant that foreign governments and foreign populations could never be entirely certain that an American reporter asking questions was not in fact an intelligence officer, a reality that endangered legitimate journalists working in dangerous parts of the world by association alone. In direct response to the Church Committee's findings, and facing mounting public pressure following Bernstein's 1977 article, CIA Director George H.W. Bush, who had taken over the agency in January of 1976, announced a new internal policy in February of 1976, stating that the agency would no longer enter into any paid or contractual relationship with any full-time or part-time news correspondent accredited by any American news service, newspaper, periodical, radio, or television network or station. This policy explicitly did not ban all contact between the CIA and journalists, only formal paid relationships with accredited correspondents, and it left considerable ambiguity about informal cooperation, freelance contributors, and relationships with media executives rather than working reporters. Critics at the time, including members of the Church Committee itself, argued that the policy contained enough loopholes to allow many of the underlying practices to continue in a less formalized way. Here's something worth sitting with for a moment before we continue. This story is sometimes told as if it ended cleanly in 1976 with a tidy policy announcement and an apology. It didn't. And if you want to understand why this story continued generating controversy and new revelations well into the 1980s, make sure you're subscribed, because the aftermath reveals just as much as the original Operation did. The fallout from these revelations reshaped American journalism in ways that extended far beyond the specific individuals named. Professional organizations like the American Society of Newspaper Editors and the Society of Professional Journalists issued new and more explicit ethical guidelines in the years following the Church Committee and Bernstein revelations, formally and unambiguously condemning any cooperation between journalists and intelligence agencies, domestic or foreign. This represented a meaningful shift in professional norms. Before the 1970s, the line between patriotic citizen and independent journalist had, for some members of the elite media establishment, been genuinely blurry, shaped by shared wartime service and shared anti-communist conviction. After the 1970s, that blurriness became professionally unacceptable, and journalism schools began teaching the CIA-media relationships of the early Cold War as a cautionary historical example of how institutional trust can be quietly compromised. It's also worth examining, with appropriate historical care, the defences offered by those involved and by historians sympathetic to the CIA's perspective on this period. Several points are worth presenting fairly. First, defenders of the agency's conduct, including some Cold War historians, have argued that the relationships in question must be understood within the specific context of an existential ideological struggle against a Soviet adversary that was, simultaneously, running its own extensive and well-funded global propaganda and intelligence recruitment operations targeting Western journalists and intellectuals. From this perspective, American intelligence cooperation with sympathetic journalists, while uncomfortable in retrospect, was a defensive response to a genuine and asymmetric threat rather than a sinister plot against the American public itself. Second, some historians point out that the majority of the documented relationships involved foreign correspondence and intelligence gathering about foreign events rather than the deliberate fabrication or planting of false domestic news stories for American audiences, a distinction that matters considerably for how we judge the severity of what occurred. Third, it bears noting that many of the journalists involved were never shown to have falsified factual reporting. Rather, the more common and better documented practice was the trading of information and occasional favourable framing, which is ethically serious but distinct from outright fabrication. At the same time, serious and credible criticism remains, and it would be dishonest to understate it. Historians and press freedom advocates have argued, with substantial justification, that even informal cooperation between journalists and intelligence agencies represents a fundamental breach of the independence that a free press requires to function as a check on government power. The very fact that the extent of these relationships could not be fully verified, that internal CIA records on the subject were and remain incomplete or classified, and that several major news organizations have never fully opened their own internal archives from this period to independent historians, means that the full truth of Operation Mockingbird, in whatever form it actually took, may never be completely known. This uncertainty is not a minor footnote. It is, in many ways, the central historical problem of this entire story. We are dealing with deliberately concealed activity, confirmed in broad outline by both journalistic investigation and formal congressional inquiry, but never fully documented in granular detail, because the nature of covert action is that records are sparse by design. This is exactly the kind of evidentiary tension that makes real history more compelling than any conspiracy theory could be. And if that's the kind of storytelling you come here for, drop a comment with which part of this investigation struck you as most credible and which part still feels unresolved, because I genuinely want to know how you're weighing the evidence. We're heading into the final stretch now, and there's still more to uncover about how far these relationships actually extended. One thread of this story that deserves particular attention because it illustrates the difference between domestic and foreign-facing propaganda efforts that the CIA itself maintained, at least in official policy, involved the Smith-Mundt Act of 1948. This law explicitly prohibited the dissemination of certain State Department and government-produced propaganda materials within the United States, materials that were permitted to be broadcast or distributed abroad through outlets like the Voice of America, but were legally barred from domestic distribution to American citizens. This legal architecture reflected a genuine, if imperfectly enforced, principle in American governance, that propaganda produced by the government for foreign audiences should not be turned inward on the American public. The CIA's media relationships existed in significant tension with this principle, because even when the agency's primary intent was gathering foreign intelligence or shaping foreign opinion, the journalists involved were American citizens working for American publications that were, by definition, also read by American audiences. This tension between the legal firewall intended to separate foreign propaganda from domestic news and the practical reality of journalists moving fluidly between foreign assignments and domestic publication is one of the more subtle but historically important dimensions of the entire controversy, and it's a tension that the Church Committee itself identified as deeply troubling regardless of how the broader question of intent was resolved. Equally significant to the historical record is Operation Mockingbird's relationship to a broader pattern of CIA domestic activity that came under scrutiny in the mid-1970s, alongside the media relationships, Operation Chaos, the mail opening program known as H-Lingle, and the agency's MKultra mind control experiments. While these programs are historically distinct from the media relationships in their specific methods and targets, historians studying this period often note that they share a common institutional root, an intelligence agency created with a charter focused on foreign operations, gradually expanding its activities inward into domestic life, surveillance, and information, often without clear legal authority and almost always without public knowledge or consent. The media relationships in this broader context were not an isolated aberration, but one expression of a wider pattern of institutional overreach that defined the CIA's first 3 decades of existence, a pattern that the Church Committee was specifically convened to expose, and where possible, to curtail through new legislative oversight mechanisms, including the creation of permanent congressional intelligence oversight committees that continue to exist in some form today. It is worth being precise in closing about what historians can state with genuine confidence and what remains genuinely disputed, because that distinction is the entire point of approaching history honestly rather than sensationally. What is confirmed beyond reasonable historical doubt, the CIA, through the Office of Policy Coordination and later through its own internal directorates, did maintain covert relationships with American journalists and media executives from at least the early 1950s through the term mid-1970s. The Church Committee's own published findings confirm relationships with several hundred individuals, including dozens of journalists directly employed by the agency. Carl Bernstein's investigative reporting, built from extensive sourcing within the CIA itself, corroborates and expands on these findings, naming specific major institutions, including the New York Times, CBS, and Time, as having had documented relationships at the leadership level. The CIA used journalistic cover for intelligence officers operating abroad, a practice confirmed by the agency's own 1976 policy announcement banning the future use of accredited correspondent status for this purpose. The term Operation Mockingbird itself, however, as a specific, official, named CIA program, remains historically unverified in declassified documentation, and its widespread use today reflects a label applied by later authors and journalists to describe a real but more loosely organised and evolving set of practices rather than a single formal operation with that exact name. What remains genuinely disputed among serious historians includes the precise scale of editorial influence the CIA exercised over published content, as opposed to simply gathering information from cooperative journalists. The full extent of Philip Graham's specific role, given that he died before the fullest allegations against him became public and could never respond to them directly, whether the relationships constituted systematic control of American news narratives or a more limited opportunistic pattern of intelligence gathering dressed in more dramatic language by later popular accounts. And perhaps most importantly, how much of this activity continued in modified form after the 1976 policy reforms, since internal compliance with that policy was never independently and fully verified by outside historians, and several CIA officials acknowledged in later interviews that informal contact between agency officers and journalists never entirely ceased, even if formal paid relationships were curtailed. What we are left with then is a story that resists easy simplification in either direction. This was not a vast, omniscient conspiracy controlling every word printed in every American newspaper, as the most exaggerated modern retellings sometimes suggest, an exaggeration that historians have specifically pushed back against. But it was also not, as some defenders have suggested, a minor and inconsequential footnote to Cold War history. It was something more genuinely unsettling than either extreme, a documented pattern confirmed by the United States government's own investigative body, in which the line between American journalism and American intelligence work grew dangerously thin for more than 2 decades, sustained not primarily through coercion, but through shared ideology, personal friendship, institutional trust, and a wartime generation's genuine belief that the Cold War demanded extraordinary measures. Whether you find that explanation reassuring or even more troubling than outright conspiracy is, in many ways, the central question this history leaves us to sit with. If this kind of carefully sourced historical deep dive is what you come here for, the channel has plenty more stories like it waiting, so make sure you've subscribed and tapped that notification bell, because there are more declassified files, more congressional hearings, and more buried Cold War history still to uncover. And before you go, I'd love to hear from you in the comments, knowing what we now know was confirmed by the Church Committee and what remains historically disputed. Where do you land on this story? Thanks for watching all the way to the end, and I'll see you in the next one.